Right, I'm starting to see comments. We have Shisina Kapungu, who is the co-champions based in Washington, D.C. with Women Strong International. We have Lakia, who is the manager at Grow Life UN Foundation, who is currently in the US. We have Rato from Nelson Mandela Bay, part of the YMCA in South Africa. We have Samantha, who is from Nairobi, currently based in Madrid. She's a member of the USAID's YP2LE Youth Advisory Group, where she supports Agenda COP alongside Shisna and myself. And then we have Catherine, who also is from Making Sense International. So I think with that, we can get started with our webinar. If you are joining in, please feel free to just introduce yourself, where you're from, and the organization that you're a part of. But I'd just like to formally introduce myself. I am Candice Chirwa. I am the Community of Practice Co-Champion and Youth Advisor for the Gender COP. I am joined with my two colleagues, Shisina Kapungu and Samantha, who also form a part of the Gender COP. And today I'm going to be a moderator for a really insightful and exciting chat where we're going to be speaking around gender advocacy and how that translates into sustainable transformation programming within policies. So if at any point you would like to engage with this conversation, you find something that's really interesting, please make sure that you use the chat feature. So let's get into our agenda for the day. We're briefly just going to introduce the Gender COP for those that are not part of the Gender COP. And if you're not part of the Gender COP, you have to definitely join. After that, we will then get into the main point of the day, which is the roundtable discussion with two incredible activists. And then after that, we will share resources and upcoming events. Awesome. So just to let people know that are not a part of the Gender COP, the Gender COP aims to promote dialogue that is inclusive, contextually relevant, and localized. So we try to take issues that have an impact, that have a direct impact into the work that we do within gender programming, within gender research, and ensure that members have access to this information, but most importantly, can contribute to this information as well, the topic at hand. The whole point of our Gender COP, beyond just providing resources, is also to ensure that we have engaging and interactive conversations so that we can learn from each other. It's always important to know that, when we are in a specific region, that we are very prone to our specific issues, but having the Gender COP available means that we can also be open to the other issues that people go through from different parts of the world. So that's incredible. And most importantly, sharing practical strategies. So if you find yourself to be an activist or a policymaker or researcher, and you want to learn directly from people who are on the ground or researchers themselves or create policies, this is the great place to learn about the strategies, to learn about the policies and implement it within your gender work. Next slide, please. Of course, it's very important that you join the Youth Power platform. We have different organized COPs. There's gender, there is youth engagement, youth strengthening. But for the gender one, if you'd like to register to join, all you have to do is just either click the link in the chat there and just register to the Gender COP, and you'll be able to have access to the multiple resources that we share. Once a week, we do share a newsletter that has resources, webinars, events, and in particular job opportunities that include consultancies for those that are within the gender space. And that's essentially very important. And the only way you can get access to that is if you click to register. Next slide, please. All right, so for today, we are going to kick off our roundtable discussion with our two incredible activists. I'd just like to briefly read their bio, just so that we have some form of context before we just get into the conversation. So we have Raisa Noor Mohammed, who is a 20-year-old intersectional activist from Johannesburg, South Africa. Raisa began the activism in 2019, doing performance art pieces to raise awareness about the climate crisis. In the beginning of 2020, at the start of their matric year, Raisa stood outside their school gates every Friday, boycotting class in demand for the South African government to declare a climate emergency and continue this boycott until the lockdown was implemented due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Raisa has since been networking and collaborating with activists and organizations both in South Africa and around the world. In 2021, Raisa crowdfunded to attend COP26, where they joined activists from all around the world in protest against the exclusionary nature of climate conferences. In 2022, Raisa attended a climate justice camp in Tunisia with almost 400 participants from 65 countries. They are currently living in Cape Town in their final year of their undergraduate degree at the University of UCT, Cape Town, where they major in environmental and geographical sciences, theatre, and anthropology. They plan to combine their passion for social justice and their love for arts and continue working on finding ways to share knowledge and connect with people about the climate change using art as a medium for communication. I think we can all give a clappy emoji for Raisa's incredible work that they have done so far. Then to briefly read Mumbi's profile, Mumbi is has worked in education, qualitative research, movement building, and community fundraising. She is passionate about advocating for people and marginalized on account of their gender and sexuality through writing, policy making, and political education. Mumbi holds a BA, a Bachelor of Arts in Public Policy from Duke University, and an MSc in African Studies from the University of Oxford. Can we all give a clappy emoji for Mumbi's incredible work thus far? Awesome. So I'm just going to ask for the slides to be turned off so that we can have the roundtable discussion with Raisa and Mumbi. And then I'm also just going to ask if Joseph can just mute themselves because we can hear their sound there in the background, or if one of the hosts can just mute Joseph's mic there. Are we able to meet Joseph there? Okay. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to kickstart with the question of the roundtable discussion, and just to encourage everyone here in chat that you're more than welcome to ask questions to Mumbi and Raisa directly using the chat feature. We will have a dedicated Q&A session if you'd want to unmute your mic and turn off your video, but for the purposes of the next 20 minutes, we're going to kick off the roundtable discussion. So I would want both Mumbi and Raisa to tell us a little bit more about what exactly inspired your advocacy journey. In particular, sorry, can you just mute Joseph's mic because I'm still hearing background noise. Thank you. Great, awesome. So just to repeat that question, apologies. Mumbi, Raisa, I'm going to start off with Raisa. Could you briefly just touch on what sparked your advocacy journey? In particular, what led you to become the intersectionalist activist? It's a tongue twister, that one. And then we'll move on to Mumbi with their journey.
Hello, thank you for having me. So what sparked my activism at first was anger, because when you're in school, no one connects the dots for you. You learn about colonization as a thing, you learn about the climate crisis as a thing, but you don't learn how everything interconnects. And when I connected these dots by myself, I was really angry and I couldn't understand why other people weren't angry. And so that's what made me want to do performance art protest pieces to raise awareness about the climate crisis. And that's also what led me to do a school boycott, because I thought that if I was so young and that I could see it, then surely people in government understood how urgent the situation is, and that means that they were deliberately ignoring it. And then as you go along the journey, your reason transforms, and at first it was anger, and then it was desperation, because you learn how dire things are. But now I think what's fueling me the most is hope. Hope because working with other activists and seeing how many people around the world care so much gives me hope, and also learning about past societies that were sustainable and learning about how they have existed, and societies that exist today that are sustainable gives me hope that it is possible for the future. And yeah, that's what inspires my activism.
Thank you so much for that. And Mumbi, would you like to tell us about what sparked your activist journey?
Yes, actually. Also, small disclaimer, I lost my voice. I'm just getting it back. So if it's hoarse or faint. That's the reason why. I'm a little bit older than Raisa, but so I think when I think of when I first became very like politically conscious, and could really identify, thinking across struggles, was maybe two events. One, activists in Nairobi, if anyone knows, have been really, especially in informal settlements. So I'm thinking of social justice centers in Mathare, Kayole, which are really poor areas in Nairobi, were really calling and asking us to think about what what the effects of police brutality have been on Nairobi's poor communities. So this was around 2014. It was the year after I finished high school. So I had a year off before I went to university. It was actually the first protest I went to, where there was 3 people who were murdered by the police here. And actually, the killers were just convicted in 2022. So the difference between those years, 2014 to 2023, just how long it took for that to happen. So that's actually the first protest I went to. And I remember just being incredibly challenged by that aspect, especially when you think about class in Nairobi. I did not grow up in a poor, informal settlement. So I was really thinking about, what does meaningful solidarity mean? We can't just be out here condemning police, but what does it mean to actually be in solidarity with oppressed people, not just for them, but really thinking about how our fates are connected. And we see that, even now, young women, when you experience some sort of sexual violence, across class, like, police are never there to like support you. So that for me was the first event where I started to see, one, ask the question of what does solidarity mean, and then also to really think about the way our fates are joined. And then I'd say the second thing is maybe also the type of student movements that were happening in 2015. You think about fees must fall, roads must fall. I was really, really interested in not just the kind of solidarity that students were having across class, specifically for students who couldn't afford fees and who are also contesting various kinds of gendered and class oppressions and their inaccessibility to the university, but also the kind of solidarity they extended to outsourced workers at their universities. They were saying, it's not just enough for me to go to school. What about the children of the people that actually clean the classrooms, that I actually go to school? There, that particular intersection is where our fates are joined. So I would really say that across the work that I do, and maybe we'll answer that as Candace asked other questions, when I specifically talk about the work that I do, the question has always been, what kinds of meaningful solidarity can we create? And then how can we think about how our fates are joined? Because I think that type of switch in the way that we're thinking, that I'm not fighting on behalf of people, but I'm actually fighting on behalf of myself. And the fact that I'm not a person, the spirit of Ubuntu, and different languages have different variations across the continent. But my fate, I'm not safe unless you're safe. And that type of, re-switching it so that it's not about fighting on behalf of people and that sort of saviorist sort of approach. I think those types of events were really important for me.
Yeah, and I think it's all intersectional, like you mentioned, your journey of, seeing just fees must fall, for example, in as much as there is one thing about access to education, quality and free education, the experiences of, disenfranchised employees, in particular students that also go to these institutions, it's all intersectional, right? We have to be very cognizant of the fact that sometimes our advocacy cannot be intersectional. There's this thing that I always say, that if feminism is not intersectional, then it's not, I don't identify. And I want that to be something that's really important as a conversation for everyone here. When we are having these conversations about climate change or gender or politics, we always often tend to forget the marginalized and the disenfranchised. And this is something that intersectional activists such as Ray and Mumbi themselves bring attention to. They bring awareness to these things so that we can be mindful and that we can say, okay, something needs to change, something needs to be done better. So just to emphasize again, if you do have any specific questions that you'd like to ask, if there's something that is not necessarily, I guess, not making sense, please feel free to ask in chat. If there's something that's resonating really deeply with you, please share that sentiment as well, so that we know that everyone is participating within this webinar. I'd like us to talk about, I guess because we live in a capitalist society, we are always driven by, measurables about success and KPIs and return on investments. And I think as an activist myself, it's very interesting trying to implement those things when it comes to measuring a movement. And I want to know from Raisa and Mumbi, how do you measure success as within your own advocacy journey? And if you can share on some successful moments in your career, whether that is something that's very relative or personal to you, or whether that's something that is policy, you shape policy, that would be very interesting to know. So Raisa, would you like to share some successful nuggets that you've experienced being an intersectional activist?
Yeah, for sure. For me, I think how I measure success is by the people that are impacted. Yeah, because I don't do so much work in policies, and I prefer working with people and like with young people, and I love working with art. My measure of success is by the people that I like touched in this way. And also, as a young activist, I think, well, in general, activists from before always led the way for the activists of now. And for me, as a young activist, when I was starting out, I had to go through a lot of different struggles. Like when I was doing my school boycott, there was so much pushback from the school, pushback from our parents who didn't really know what we were doing. Yeah, there wasn't as much support. There wasn't as many examples of people locally that were doing what I was doing. And now lots of different organizations by youth and for youth are starting up that are specifically to give young activists support. And there's a specific organization, Kamara, which I've been talking to, that they've been reaching out to young activists and consulting them about security for activists and how to create safety for young activists in terms of legal things, which is something I never had and wasn't a thing a few years ago. So for me, a measure of success in my activism is by how it impacts, people that come after me, and how it makes the lives of activists that come after me easier, and them having more support and more access to information than I did. So for me, that's a measure of success.
That's very important. I think,
how angry politicians get. That's also a measure of success.
Getting that reaction. If they weren't angry,
the angrier the capitalists are, the better I'm doing.
That's incredible. I love that. I'm going to use that as a great way to measure success. Did we get the reaction that we needed within the advocacy movement? And Mumbi, how do you measure success as an advocate, as an activist? Do you apply the same, form of metrics when it comes to success from a normal, like a corporate job within activism? Please share.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'd say that, well, first I'd like to explain the work that I did, because I think before we spoke about our backgrounds, but maybe before I explain success, I'll just explain like two, I'd say, projects that I hold dear. I mean, one of them is out of COVID, a couple of friends and I who are all queer and trans in this Nairobi started this mutual aid fund called Trans and Queer Fund, which was really focused on how to give people access to low sort of like low red tape, like grants for like the everyday living. A lot of the funds that come in that for queer and trans people are really focused on programming and advocacy, especially around repealing things like the penal code, so codes 162, 165, and then also creating programming that's focused on creating community. And we all know, I guess, working in some of these spaces, how difficult it is to reallocate kind of those funds to, in times of emergency, especially when we're thinking about rent, we're thinking about food, water, that sort of thing. So a couple of friends and I decided to make this fund that would really focus on community fundraising. So again, highlighting the fact that even though we're all queer and trans, we don't all have the same sort of like financial precarities. Some of us have different privileges and class privileges in specific. And if we're thinking again with this ethic of Ubuntu, I am because you are, it's impossible for us to work towards any sort of freedom if we're not organizing from the bottom. We're not thinking about people who are most precarious, because of course, there's no way for you to encounter police who are going to harass you as a queer and trans person if you're not poor and if you don't live in impoverished areas. So we're also thinking about what it means to disrupt sort of like the high sort of threshold that queer and trans Africans are required to sort of prove in order to show that they're in danger. So if we're thinking about intersectionality, that we know that there's no way, like I just said, to think about queer and trans precariousness without thinking about class. And also the ways on accessing funds can often be really undignified. Like you really have to prove that you're in danger because of your queerness or your transness, when oftentimes it's not because of that. It's because of a combination of factors that include queerness and transness, but are not so cookie cutter. So we were really thinking about that. So when I think about success with this kind of work, I think about success in the way that I see people becoming I see more community building amongst people, more concern about people's welfare across our community. I see people who have benefited from the fund, wanting to give back, even if it's just 100 bob, which is less than $1. Like when they get to a better point in their life, they're like, I definitely want to pay it forward, even if it's small. So, this kind of responsibility that we have amongst ourselves for each other's well-being, I see that a lot. And then I also, a really key part of our work was that we never wanted to have this sort of monopoly of a mutual aid, especially since it's community fundraising. We've never gotten any funds from donors, and to date, we've fundraised almost $50,000. We've never gotten a single cent from donors. It's all just been people contributing and exchanging in kind and also in terms of money. I think just seeing other people taking up the idea and integrating it into their own organizing activist work and recognizing the fact that even though political rights are important, there's no political rights we're accessing if we don't have food to eat on the table, if we don't have a roof over our head. So starting to see that analysis slowly being integrated and being thought about even amongst donors as well has been really interesting. And I don't think we're the only ones who are doing this work, but it's been great to be part of that moment. And then the second piece of work I want to talk about is my day job. I do stuff around narrative shifting work. So thinking about how we can shift attitudes around controversial sexuality and reproductive health rights issues. So from access to safe and legal abortion to sexuality education. So really trying to disrupt the monopoly that the Western right has over how we speak about these things online. So not just thinking about the digital security, but taking a step further, like how do we disrupt like opposition online? And it's slow work, narrative change work, the projections and what we're seeing, especially from Latin America, where they've really been doing this work for a moment now, is 7 to 10 years before you start to see shifts as a result of your campaigns. So we don't have gains to show exactly right now, but I'm saying in terms of coalition building, it's been really exciting to see different, groups of actors that would have never worked together before coming together as a result of our work. So we know that a lot of SRHR organizations work and communicate within a silo, but starting to see people communicating in a way that's actually thinking about the values of their audiences and what might be compelling, starting to see people collaborating in, across disciplines. So not just activists, talking in these technical languages, but, actually collaborating with creatives, with journalists to actually think about how we can form like mass movements, strong movements that share expertise in order to shift narratives. So just seeing those connections and seeing, the work pay off of coalition building has been really exciting for me.
Incredible. And I love that you briefly touched into some challenges that you faced from a financial aspect, because I think that prompts me to our next question, which is basically what challenges do you face within the advocacy sphere? And I also want to add on to this question, the question that Natasha poses, where she asks, advocacy work can be taxing on our mental health and wellness. How do you both practice self-care? So I think in response to the challenges, the broad challenges question, it would be nice to know how you incorporate some form of self-care, because as an activist myself, I can relate with, always going into communities, providing time and energy, and oftentimes seeing that my battery is being drained. So how do we always make sure that we are charging our batteries? So Raisa, would you like to let us know the challenges that you face as an intersectional activist, and how do you practice self-care within your work?
Well, as an activist, there's lots of different layers to challenges you face. There's your own, like within yourself, and then there's external. And I think my self-care for both kind of relates for me. Something I struggle a lot with is imposter syndrome. And yeah, I think most, if not all, activists experience this imposter syndrome, where they wonder if they're doing enough, or if they're when they get opportunities, if they deserve these opportunities. And another thing that I really struggle with is also just, when you're working with really heavy things, heaviness, it becomes like activism isn't something separate. It's not like a job where you can just go and then clock up at the end. It's very emotional, intense work, and it sits difficultly in your mind. And then my solution, or my ways of self-care for both, is other people, and just trusting and relying on other people, trusting that other people. Well, I was in a climate justice camp in Lebanon. I just got back from that, and someone during one of the plenaries said something that I thought was so profound. She was talking about imposter syndrome and feeling that, there's so many cool people here. What is she doing here? And then she said that it was about trust, that everyone else, that just how I trust that everyone else deserves to be there, they trust me to be there as well. And yeah, in dealing with imposter syndrome, I think trusting people and trusting yourself is really important. And then with dealing with burnout and just that emotional turmoil, being able to lean on other people and opening yourself up to other people. And yes, for me, one of my biggest ways of dealing with, the despair is seeing how much other people care. And that gives me a lot of hope. And then with other challenges, I guess, just pushback from the people around you, pushback like on policy levels. When I was during my school boycott, it was the Ministry of Environmental Affairs pushing back, and my school pushing back, my parents pushing back. And then also you get those little other fears that and then people like constantly telling you that this isn't sustainable and asking you how you're gonna sustain yourself, and you get really frustrated because you don't know how to explain that it's not about me. Like, it's not about me. I'm not doing this for myself. But then you also get people who don't take you seriously. You get people movements that just frustrate you a lot, because there's a massive difference between global north and global south movements. And then you get that thing of being silenced. If it's not by other activists, then it's by media, and it's a lot. And I think just constant doing the work and addressing it is important. And then also trusting other people trusting that you don't have to do these things all the time. You don't have to be the one constantly fighting and arguing. Trusting other people, trusting that they are also doing the work, and so allowing yourself to kind of step back when you need to. that's also a way of dealing with it. And yeah, actually, just to touch on what Mumbi said about Ubuntu and having that in other languages. Actually, at the camp, one of the things we learned when we were doing a collective poem is this word, kapwa, from the Philippines, I think Tagalog, and it means what Ubuntu means. And I thought it was really beautiful that in different languages, we kind of have that same thing, that Ubuntu.
And I think he touched beautifully on the whole imposter syndrome element, you know, constantly having to, outside of the fact that you're fighting the system, also having to fight your own obstacles, you know, your own mental sort of little thoughts as to whether you qualify, whether the speech you said makes sense, whether it's really, really important that I think we also make space for mental health, and we also say how we deal with mental health. And I don't know if anyone has noticed that Ray has a wonderful wall of art there. So I think that's also another way in which she is able to practice self-care, you know, finding different alternative hobbies as a way to sort of disconnect is really important. And Mumbi, I'm curious to know, you know, outside of the challenges you face within your, you know, your career, how do you practice self-care? How do you unwind? How do you reset and re-energize so that you can constantly give back within your activism?
Okay, when I think of the fund, for example, a really key problem for us has been how do we get like our form of organization right, especially if we're thinking about it as a collective. None of us are paid for this work. And how do we keep going, especially when it's like, you know, people sometimes, you know, have urgent like emergencies, crises. You know, someone needs, like, is about to get kicked out by the landlord, or is doesn't have food like now. You know, how do we take care of ourselves while also balancing the sort of like urgent needs, and you know, continuing with that thread of treating people with dignity and taking their concerns and really being guided by their interests. I mean, one thing is that we really had to like experiment with the form of organization that we have. So instead of, and it's difficult for us because I think all of us have grown up in an activist space that's really saturated by nonprofits. It's not a bad thing necessarily. I mean, we can talk about it. I mean, I'm also sort of implicated and work within the space, but because that's a dominant form, thinking outside that box and thinking about what it means to like build, you know, across like with as many people as possible so that you're able to share the work as much as possible is you know, something that we've been doing, which helps with like mental health, but is also just like difficult because how do you maintain momentum? How do you maintain people's sort of engagement and people's involvement and participation in the work when there's no sort of economic incentive? And that's the norm for sort of like activist work, especially in Nairobi. Anyone who works in Nairobi knows that, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's the fact that people need food to eat at the end of the day. And, you know, showing up for conferences, all these things are kinds of labor in itself. But when we don't have that to offer, what other kinds of incentives make us continue with the work? In terms of like other things with mental health, sometimes we just have to stop. We just have to stop the fund for like 2 months or something just to recollect ourselves. And I think the fantastic thing about the work that we do is that it's really because it involves people caring for each other. I think in a way it's sort of been breaking that sort of clientelistic like relationship that sometimes exists between like nonprofits and people that they're serving, where you're expecting a service. I think now we're all involved in this work. So it means that it follows that some of us need a break here and there. And so I think there's also that understanding that it's sometimes too much, and it's a give and take, and give as much as you can and take, you know, what you need exactly. And that's sort of like an anti-capitalist like politics, but it's also just like, you know, really taking into consideration that everyone is a person. So that, I mean, I would talk about the individual forms of care that I do, but I don't think it's as productive as thinking about how we take care of each other.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely very crucial that we share this information as a way to perhaps inspire any activists or people who want to get within activism in this webinar, to know that it's okay if you're not feeling all right, and actively setting those boundaries to make sure that you're cognizant of the fact that if you want to provide impactful work, you have to be okay. And I think that's really important. And also understanding that no matter what career you're in, you will face challenges, but within the activism space, it is very unique and niche in that, yes, you're doing public benefits, but sometimes there could be financial aspects to it that you'll have to think about. You'll have to sort of realize that, yes, we live in a capitalist society, so not all work can be free, especially if you're running your own organization or if you are working for an organization. So that's really important. I think those challenges there that were provided by Raisa and Mumbi were really great. And just for our final question, before we get into Q&A, I want us to speak beyond just, how we understand advocacy and activism to look like. Often it's, portrayed as something where you get a group of people, you go and you march to a certain place, and then that's it for the day. How do we make sure that whatever it is that we are doing in terms of being activists and research activists on the ground, that these policies that we're advocating for are sustainable and inclusive? And how do you do that in your own work is, I think, very important to sort of share amongst the webinar. So Raisa, I'd like to hand that question over to you. Beyond just, going to conference, how do you lobby for policies to be inclusive, especially for marginalized groups that are directly impacted by climate change and gender?
For me, one of my biggest passions is grassroots, and that's also what gives me hope, and what drives me just fighting for a grassroots future. And I think with that comes, research into grassroots methodologies and constant. Yeah, so I think for me, because my focus is grassroots, that comes with that need to be inclusive, intersectional. And so you have to constantly be examining yourself and examining the methods you use and examining what you do. And I think one of the most important things as an activist and as someone who wants to be inclusive and build an inclusionary space is to always be open to being wrong. And accepting that sometimes you're wrong and sometimes you're going to do something that is harmful, and you need to be open to that and acknowledge it. And I think it's really important because a lot of people, myself included, it takes a lot to be able to say that you're wrong and acknowledge it within yourself, especially if it's something that you care about. And if you don't want to hurt people, acknowledging that you did and that your methods might not be the best it's difficult. And so I think constantly learning, being open to that process of learning is more than anything, I think that's really important. And if you want to be inclusionary, and just taking advice.
Definitely. And Mumbi, would you like to share, how do the issues that we advocate and, provide awareness on, how do they live beyond and become sustainable and are inclusive for marginalized communities?
I'd say maybe two things, and it's connected to some of the things that are in the chat anyway. But one is I think something I've been speaking about is forming coalitions and collaborations with people. I think there's no way that any one of us can hold every single experience or every single lens of understanding what it is to be a person in this world and to experience varied forms of oppressions. And I don't think it's strategic anyway. I think we don't want this work to sort of be siloed and sort of monopolized by any group of people, including those like me who have education and particular kinds of degrees. It needs to be mass movements that are sort of led by the people who are most vulnerable. So we need to build coalitions that are focused on like sharing expertise, exchanging resources, and joining connections across different concerns and interests. And then I say the other thing is the importance of not over-determining people's sort of approaches and strategies. I'd say one thing that I've experienced as someone who is like an organizer around trans and queer issues in Kenya, or Nairobi specifically, is feeling like the approaches and strategies that we have are really over-determined by the people who are funding a lot of the bigger organizations. So, you know, in the West, queer freedom has looked like marriage equality, and other kinds of civil rights. But for us, really thinking about, you know, what is important or what will truly allow the most marginalized and oppressed amongst us in order to live like a safe and secure life. So for me, that thinking and trying to disentangle, you know, various approaches and to really understand the kinds of politics that shape even what we are demanding has been really important. Yeah, and then also listening, even if you're in a particular space, listening and learning from other movements as well. I think for me, one other movement and then thinking about their trajectories, especially in your own space. I think sometimes it's easier to think about, okay, what has the trans and, you know, queer movement done in somewhere like Brazil or something like that, or somewhere like Spain. But what has the movement for food justice done and seed sovereignty done here in Kenya, and what can we learn from them, and what kinds of connections can we build with them? So for me, I've really seen a lot of potential in thinking across movements, and then also thinking across, and then also trying to really disentangle approaches and thinking from our context.
Great. And yeah, I think that's really, really beneficial. And I'm seeing that we are having questions in the chat. So we are going to dedicate the last 10 minutes to answering these questions. I'm going to ask questions in general, and then Raisa and Mumbi, feel free to answer if you want to. We have a question from Catherine, who's asking if you have any resources, books, articles, podcasts that affected how you think about intersectional activism. If in particular you have any podcasts, I enjoy listening to podcasts. Please let us know if you do have them. Feel free to leave them in chat. If you know them on top of your mind, you're more than welcome to just mention as well. But if you have access to them, you can just share the links for Catherine there. Samantha is saying, thank you, Raisa and Mumbi. My question revolves around the potential challenge of building transnational solidarities, especially within the gender advocacy space. How do you ensure that while fostering these connections, you don't unintentionally erase the crucial distinctions related to factors like location, historical context, class dynamics, and political variations? What strategies or principles can help us present the oversimplification or homogenization of the experiences and histories within marginalized or disenfranchised groups? Anyone would like to answer that? Mumbi, Ray?
Okay, I'll go. Yeah, I think that when I said you need to be open to being wrong, yeah, that comes here because you're human, and in your activism journey there are going to be moments where you make a mistake, where you slip up, and where you do unintentionally sometimes be harmful, because you're still learning. And I think when we did touch on it, what's really important is with coalitions is, you know, the acknowledgement that the only person that can tell their story are the people themselves. And so when you're trying to foster connections, do it. For me, one of the most important things that I've learned in my activism that changed the way I do anything is the importance of entering a space with the intention of neutral learning instead of entering a space with the intention to educate, which is a mistake that I made in the beginning of my activism. I assumed that I need to educate, and I realized that I need to be open to learning. And the same here, you need to, when forming partnerships and forming coalitions, you need to acknowledge that you're there to kind of learn, and your partnership to build strength and to give each other support. And you're supporting people in their movements, and you're giving them support without taking the mic, because that's the importance of solidarity and unity, being able to support each other and give each other strength without taking the mic, without taking a platform, because that's how we need to exist. That's what we need to do as communities, and as people, we need to support each other. And yeah.
Yeah, Mumbi, would you like to respond to that?
I think Raisa has captured it perfectly, but maybe I would add an example. I'd say one of like the most interesting and really motivating examples of solidarity that doesn't sort of paper over like differences is maybe like the movement solidarity against like Palestinians and their struggle for, you know, their land back in Palestine. It was so interesting, especially during COVID and the various intifadas that happened during that period, seeing different communities that have experienced like occupations, and not just at a national level with an army like the Israeli army, but thinking even from here in Nairobi, there were so many solidarity statements for people who live in low income, sort of over-policed, over-surveilled, under-resourced, informal settlements, who are talking about what the effects are of like being forced to live in a small like piece of land, millions of people, talking about how their labor is used to sort of subsidize the lives of people who are wealthier than them, talking about what it means to be over-surveilled, especially young boys and young men, and thinking about how those experiences sort of reflect the types of experiences that young Palestinians have as, you know, they're experiencing occupation, especially in places like Gaza. So really thinking about how can we amplify the demands of people. If we're thinking about solidarity for places like Palestine, you saw people thinking about how can we demand like and amplify that particular struggle by talking about the connections and how the sort of like strategies of oppression that have been pioneered in Palestine are kind of imported and exported elsewhere. So really thinking about, okay, yes, we can amplify a particular movement, but yes, there's differences in how we experience it, but still drawing those connections. So I think there's so much to learn about that particular issue from different movements that are already in existence, and the types of solidarities that even people in our own sort of geographies are kind of offering and exchanging.
Great. And we have a question from Patricia, where she asks, well, she says, it's been exciting listening to both panelists, Mumbi and Raisa, very motivated by your commitment as young activists. Thank you so much. I was wondering, are there moments where you felt no need to continue your advocacy, that is wanting to give up, and how did you navigate that to sustain your energy to be more inclusive? I guess it touches mostly on the mental health aspect. Mumbi, Raisa, would you like to respond to that question?
I think, yeah, it's definitely, especially when you're a young activist and doing it out of passion, it's difficult because you get to a point where you need to sustain yourself. And activism takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of energy, it takes a lot of resources, it takes a lot out of you. And sometimes, and I know with a lot of people, it's difficult to sustain your activism and sustain yourself. But yeah, I think for me, sometimes with my activism and being young and being, well, I'm 21, it's difficult because sometimes you want to live like a normal life and you wish you could stop caring. You wish you could just stop caring and focus on yourself. But once you know things, once you learn things, you can't unlearn them. And for me, it's like, now that I know about capitalism and the climate crisis and the inequalities that exist, and now that I've met people and spoken to people who are living in horrific situations, who are directly impacted by the climate crisis, I could, like, choosing to, just focus on myself and ignoring it would be choosing complacency. And for me, I can't. But also, one of the things that I know has definitely fueled a lot of my activism is the fact that I'm bipolar. And being bipolar, there's some things that bipolar people have, like, really deep passions and feel things really deeply. And so I didn't realize this until recently, but I think a lot of my activism has been that I'm so passionate about social justice. And so there are a lot of moments where I wished that I could just stop caring so deeply. And also doing activism, during this type of activism, you kind of not give up a normal life, but you can't really have that stability, because I know in the next few years, like, I'm not going to be able to have that stability. There's going to be lots of traveling, lots of just intensity, and I wish sometimes I could have more stability, but there isn't a point where I felt like I've needed to give it up, because I know that I can't. For me, this fight isn't for me. I'm not fighting for myself. And so I don't think I've ever, felt a moment where I didn't feel like I needed to do this anymore, because it's really urgent. And yeah.
Thank you so much, Ray. That is beautifully put. I think being in touch with themselves to know how we give back is as crucial. And Mumbi, would you like to briefly talk about how you navigate sustaining your energy, just to give inspiration to those that would want to know how they can continue when the world is going through so much, how they can continue to keep the energy up, before we close off?
I would just add, I think for me, even identifying with the word activist has been weird. It's been weird hearing myself referred to as that, just because I've never organized as not part of a collective. I think all my work has been, I don't even know if people know me individually through my name, but when I say like the fund name, people recognize that, which is great. It removes the personal pressure, but also means that the work is sustainable beyond me as an individual. And I think knowing that it exists beyond me has been really good for my mental health. Knowing that, even if I were to quit today, or take a break just for my own well-being, the work exists and people want to continue it further. It's not just one individual. So I think really shifting away from sort of the individualizing notion of activism that I think circulates a lot, and now thinking of myself as part of a collective and as part of a community, and allowing people to contribute, because oftentimes people just want to know, okay, how can I help, and how can I support the work that you're doing, has been really important, and I think it's something that we can all take up.
Thank you so much, Mumbi. I would just like to honestly give my flowers, my virtual flowers, to you, Mumbi, to you, Raisa, for the incredible work that you're doing. And that we notice the selfless acts that you do. And I think we have benefited incredibly from this conversation. And I think it's important that everyone still remains in touch. So Mumbi and Ray, if you don't mind just dropping perhaps your LinkedIn links or your social media handles, so that everyone can be able to follow your work and just support it. And I think that community is really important. So I'd just like to thank everyone for joining the webinar. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Shisina, who's just going to go through some of the events that we have with Youth Power 2 Learning Network.
Thanks. What a wonderful discussion, and thank you for being so authentic and transparent. We wanted to let you know about 2 opportunities from USAID. First, join us for the #United for Inclusion contest. This 4-week campaign hosted by Youth Lead and across social media platforms rallies youth to join this movement and share their diverse perspectives on inclusion. So we invite you to participate, to share your compelling photos, audio clips, or written pieces that embody the essence of inclusion in one of the following categories: inclusive work development, Jesse, inclusive activism, inclusive representation, and inclusive sports. So you can submit your applications by September 12th. And it has a range of prizes, such as visibility opportunities, as well as Instagram live discussions. You can check the website to see the list. And then the second one is the Youth Well-Being Prize Competition, empowering young people to reach their full potential. So if you're ready to showcase digital tools by young people, so are you, or do you know a young person between the ages of 10 and 29 with an idea of how digital tools can be used to help improve other young people's well-being, then this is the opportunity for you. And this closes on September 29th, and the grand prize is between $2,000 to $5,000. We'll put more information about these opportunities in the link. And please continue to watch us on youthpower.org, and we will always have our newsletter on Mondays. So thank you everyone for joining, and watch more for more updates. Thank you to our panelists.